Snares are an integral part of your drums, as they help provide the foundation and backbone to your rhythm. One of the most common problems that producers have when adding in snares is their lack of power and presence in the mix. Oftentimes, producers will choose a single sample that doesn't carry enough weight and power to have an impact in the mix. My name is Daniel with Envato Tuts. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to layer your snare drums. So let's get into the DAW. The first step in layering your snare drums is choosing the correct samples. You need to choose samples that work well together and don't conflict with each other frequency-wise. I like to have my snares layered. To create this powerful snare drum, I like to layer up 3 different samples: a main layer, a high layer, and a character layer. The main layer will provide the main timbre of your sound and will really define your snare drum. The next layer, the high layer, will be higher frequencied and help fill out the high range of the frequency spectrum. And the third layer, the character layer, will add in a unique character to your snare drum. So let's have a listen to the samples that I chose. The main layer here. Then we have the high layer, which is just a clap. And then next, the character layer. And for this character layer, I chose a tom sample, but really you can use any type of sample here. It can be another snare sample, it can be a bell sound, it can be a Foley sample. Any sound that adds a unique timbre to your snare drum is recommended. And if we play all 3 of these together, you can hear it is already sounding much more powerful and impactful. The next part of our layering process is adjusting the pitching of each sound to make sure that they all gel together. If we go back to the main snare here, I like the character that this sample gives. So I'm not going to adjust the pitch of this main layer. I'm going to adjust the pitches of the high layer and the character layer, the tom, to have them fit in a little bit better and be more impactful. So let's start with the high layer. We'll solo the main layer and the high layer, and then click on the audio clip and then adjust the transpose. So 1 semitone up, this high clap layer gels much nicer with our main snare layer. Now let's have a listen to the snare without the high layer and then with. Now with. So you can hear it just adds in an extra bit of high-end frequency, a little more power, and a little more presence. So this high layer, you don't necessarily need an overpowering layer that adds a bunch of weight and takes over the mix. A little goes a long way here. And now let's adjust the tom. We can go ahead and adjust the tom with the main and high layer playing as well. And click on the audio clip, and we'll adjust the transpose. So at around -2 semitones, the tom fits in much nicer with our samples. Without our tom, now with, so you can hear it adds in a little more body to our snare. And next, we're going to adjust the fades of our audio clips, specifically at the start of each sample. If we zoom in on our audio clips all the way to the beginning of each sample, we can see that there's a lot of transient material happening right when all the layers begin to start playing. A buildup of these transients will create dynamic imbalances in your mix and will lead to problems in the mastering stage, as the buildup of these transients will create loud peaks, and these loud peaks will start to distort much quicker when a master limiter is thrown on and prevent you from getting your track up to commercial loudness. So what we can do to fix this is adjust the fades of our audio clips. Once again, I like the character of the main snare. I like the snap and punchiness of it, so we'll leave that untouched. And I'll just adjust the fades of the tom and the clap here. So a simple fade will do here, just to make sure that the initial transient of the tom and the clap don't interfere with the initial transient of the snare here. So fading them in will allow this transient to come through and won't create a buildup and cause this dynamic imbalance. So let's have a listen. You can hear that the snare is a little bit cleaner now. Next, we're going to do some EQing to these layers. We'll start with the high end and we'll add in an EQ. This will just once again help clean up the mix and make these snares blend together well and be as impactful as possible. Since this is a high frequency layer, we don't require a lot of low frequencies, so we can remove the low frequencies all the way up to around 330 Hertz here, as this will just muddy up the mix. All this information here below 330 Hertz is being taken up by the snare and the tom. Then next we'll add an EQ to the snare and we'll cut it around 85 Hertz here, as we don't need any of the sub frequencies in this sound. The sub in our track will be covering this. And then next we'll add in a high shelf filter and we'll just bring down the high shelf around 1.6 decibels or so at 3.6 thousand kilohertz. And the slight dampening of the high frequencies will allow our high frequency clap to shine through a bit more. As again, we want these elements to work well together, and the samples that we chose will help fill out the frequency spectrum. So leaving room for each sample to shine is necessary. And now let's again have a listen. And we're going to go ahead and leave the tom alone. No EQing is required, as I don't hear any conflict between the main snare layer and the tom. If we go ahead and listen to these together, there's no muddy frequencies, and they gel well together. And then finally, we'll add in a compressor to our group of layers here. A standard compressor will work, and what this compressor is going to do is further gel these elements together and add just a little more impact. Let's adjust our settings here. The ratio or strength of the compressor, we'll put it around 3:1, as we want the compressor to be a little bit strong but not too much. And a ratio of 3:1 will do this. And for the attack, we want an attack of around 14 milliseconds or so, as we want the initial transient of our snare to come through. If we had it at 0.01 milliseconds, the entire snare would be compressed and it would flatten out the impact of the transient of the snare. And if we had too long of an attack, then none of our layers would be compressed. So just letting a little bit through with an attack of around 14 milliseconds will work here. And for the release, we'll keep it at 50 milliseconds. We don't want it too short, as this won't give the compressor enough time to compress our snare drum and glue it together. And too long of a release will overcompress our layers here. And we'll adjust the threshold while listening to these layers. And again, a little goes a long way here. And with this added compressor, there's more impact and a little more snap to our snare drum. So you can see with careful sample selection, pitching of our samples, fading in transients, some basic EQing, and compression, you can create a powerful snare drum that can provide the backbone for your track.